Small hands are often thought of as a disadvantage for a pianist. It's certainly true things appear anyway to be easier for those with larger hands. However, I think if we can learn to think like a smaller-handed player right from the start of the learning process, then we'll be much less impacted by this. So today let's look at 3 important things I think we need to think about. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. A long time ago I released a video with some tips for smaller handed pianists like myself. And in that video I did promise to share any further discoveries I made that help with piano mastery for those of us with smaller hands. The video on screen now, which I've also linked below for you, has been doing the rounds recently on social media. You might have seen it. You know, aside the clickbait title, one very interesting thing discussed in it is that when a smaller handed pianist is presented with a slightly resized keyboard, so slightly smaller keys, they find it to be a totally liberating experience, and suddenly everything seems to become so much easier. So much so that the impact of this can also carry over when they go back to playing on a normal sized keyboard. Yet of course, there are world-class pianists with smaller hands. Daniel Barenboim's hands, from what I can see, look very similar in size to my own, yet his Beethoven ranks amongst the best in the world. Equally, there are lots of enormously gifted children who can pull off amazing feats of pianism with frankly tiny little hands. Therefore, hand size per se clearly is not an actual barrier to playing piano well. The secret, though, I believe, is that we need to take our hand size into account much earlier on in the learning process, rather than thinking about it only in terms of workarounds, if you like, when we need to do something from time to time in a certain passage of music. What I mean by this is that often the only advice I seem to see for people with smaller hands is specifically how to get around something such as a large stretch. However, I think we need to start thinking like smaller-handed pianists and play in ways adapted to our hands as the rule rather than the exception. For example, I saw a video of Daniel Barenboim playing the Adagio from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and he redistributes those 9th stretches, taking the lower note in his left hand. This, I'm sure, is not because he has to do this, but because it gives him more control when he does. He isn't trying to make his hands do something any more difficult than it needs to be simply because of the way it's notated on the page. In fact, I think there are 3 main principles that we need to think about. First, what gives us the maximum amount of control? Secondly, what fingering is best suited to us? And thirdly, how should we actually move at the piano? Let's first then think about control. Now, whenever we need to hold our hands in a sort of awkward position, being able to finally control our playing becomes much more difficult. Where something's very awkward, simply hitting the correct notes can be difficult enough and quite hit and miss. However, even when something is just a little bit awkward, then our ability to finally control the voicing, say, will almost certainly be impaired. I made an interesting discovery once while sitting at a bar of all places some time ago. The tabletop was made of mosaic tiles, and the size of each tile being about the same size as a fingertip, you know. I absent-mindedly put my fingers onto the individual tiles and then moved just one of them at a time. And what I found was that often on doing this, I'd put my hand into an uncomfortable position that, if I'd maintained it for too long, would start to make me feel quite tense. However, what I discovered to my surprise was that if I simply let my hand relax and potentially just let the fingers find a slightly different position or the wrist a slightly different angle, then what was previously an uncomfortable position became perfectly fine. Now, if we apply this to music, I've found that when playing, say, repeated chords, then avoiding holding my fingers in position actually gives me far more control and is less tiring. So effectively letting my hand relax between each chord actually helps, as often some of the intervals in the chords can be a tiny bit stretchy for our fingers, and building a reflex to avoid any tendency to hold a stretched position is very worthwhile. The passage here from the Marcello Bach Oboe Concerto is a good example. But also think about this when playing waltzes, for example. If we learn to build in a reflex to relax between each chord, even when we don't specifically need to do it, then once we start needing it, we'll be doing it anyway automatically. Another example for me would be octaves. I've seen videos talking about the importance of holding the fingers in a fixed position to play octaves. And I think with large hands, this is probably fine. I bet Lang Lang can reach an octave with just a tiny, tiny flex of his large fingers. For me, it very quickly becomes uncomfortable. Yet by allowing my hands to relax ever so slightly between each octave, I find I have much greater stamina and control, as my hands don't tire anything like as quickly. If we get into the habit of doing this even where there is just, say, a couple of octaves at a time, which we could probably play without tension, then the reflex again becomes inbuilt for when we have much longer runs of them. Now let's think about fingering. I've noticed that often the fingerings given by editors are not really optimized for somebody with smaller hands. Even in intermediate music, we frequently run into issues with suggested fingerings. As an example, I've been recently working on a piece called Repos d'amour by Henselt, and some of the suggested fingerings for me are almost impossible to execute. In this measure, for example, using 3 on the melody note leaves me with a very awkward stretch. There are lots of other examples like this, and to be honest, more often than not, I'll actually use 4 score to blank out the fingerings that are written in, as if anything, they just end up confusing me. And then as the music grows in complexity, then this challenge increases. Even when fingering is suggested by a top-flight concert pianist, it doesn't mean it will be suitable for everyone. For example, Marc-André Hamelin was interviewed on the fingering work he did for Henley. And in this interview, he freely concedes that some of his fingerings are unlikely to work for smaller hands. Indeed, having large hands, he said he can only really speak about what works for him, and goes on to say that anyway, pianists with smaller hands are very good at finding other very imaginative ways of achieving the same musical result. The fact is that only we know how a fingering feels, whether it's good or bad. And for that reason, studying fingering in more depth and much earlier on in the learning process, I think is absolutely vital for us. Only by really experimenting with different options and finding those that work best will we build better reflexes in terms of fingering schemes to use. Again, we should be doing this as the rule and not just the exception. If we only ever look for alternatives when we either simply can't do something or it hurts, then we'll never really know if the fingering being used is best suited to our hands. I think that often with easier music, we don't take the time to do this, as to be honest, the odd awkward stretch really doesn't become too debilitating, does it? However, as we start taking on music that is more and more complex, these fingering habits are already ingrained and we're less good at using alternatives. Now, there are lots of very gifted teachers who can give us excellent advice on fingering. And if we're clear that a certain fingering doesn't feel good for us, they'll do this for us. For example, I've been working on Mozart's Rondo in A minor. It's one of those pieces in the Piano: A History in 100 Pieces by Susan Tomes that I've been reading recently and looking over the music at the same time as I've been going through the book. And there's a particular passage that I could find a fingering for, however, it always felt uncomfortable. And it was one of those things where, with sufficient practice, I'm sure I could have got it under control. But ideally, to play things well, it's better when they feel easy. In the past, I probably just have persevered with it. However, I posted on one of my favourite Facebook groups looking for suggestions and received a number of amazingly elegant solutions. Each was perfectly suited to achieving the exact musical result Mozart wanted in the original way he'd written it. However, by simply redistributing some of the notes between the hands, it gave me ways to play it where there was absolutely no awkward stretch at all. So an in-depth study of piano fingering should be something that we push for, whether it be self-study or with our teacher. I've discovered to my cost that when we need to relearn a passage where we've persevered with a less than ideal fingering strategy, it's a long and painstaking process sometimes. For example, we're initially taught to avoid too many thumb crossings, yet this doesn't always translate well into a piece of music. It can in many places pay dividends to use our thumb more frequently than a traditional fingering scheme, if you like, would suggest. Take Debussy's Clair de Lune as an example. The C-sharp minor section is something that I've never felt was perfectly controlled in my playing. However, by breaking with the traditional arpeggio type fingering I'd always used in the past and making greater use of my thumb, I came to an all the more easy to control solution. Another obvious example is using the thumb on a black note. When we first taught, we're encouraged to avoid this. However, whilst perhaps a good starting point for very simple music, we should most definitely not worry about this as we progress. Using our thumb on black notes can really help us bring our hand into position easily when playing, as I demonstrated in this video on Bach's D minor prelude. Fortunately, there is an excellent book on piano fingering that is readily available on Amazon. It's called The Art of Piano Fingering, Traditional, Advanced and Innovative, and it teaches exactly what the title suggests. Aside from expressly offering advice on things such as avoiding stretches as we work through it, by applying the principles it contains elsewhere, we will also discover for ourselves alternative ways of fingering that help in many other circumstances. In fact, in the Mozart example I gave earlier, 2 of the alternative fingering suggestions I received were from the author of this book, a gentleman called Rami Barniv. Now then, let's think a little bit about movement. Whilst there are very often fingering choices that can help us, often we'll also need to rely on learning how to optimize the way we move. I'm sure you'll have come across things such as forearm rotation, wrist circles, and a whole host of other techniques that we can use. Yet at the same time, I'm sure you'll also have come across those who advocate removing any unnecessary motion, even occasionally going to the point that fingers need to be totally independent and that we shouldn't use our wrist or forearm as some kind of crutch to compensate for them. I firmly believe that for the smaller-handed pianists, incorporating good, healthy movement as early as possible is a vital thing, that again, it becomes normal rather than something we just do occasionally. We can take an example of the opening of Liszt's Liebestraum. Now, in this video, the pianist playing it, who is fantastic, it has to be said, seems to do so exclusively just using her fingers. However, we can also see that her hands barely need to stretch to cover those arpeggios, and therefore she probably won't move any more than she needs to. However, for my hands, this is simply not the case. I'm not saying that it's an impossible stretch, of course not. And indeed, in Rami's book, where in addition to fingering, he offers advice on technique in general, he does make the point that some degree of momentary stretching is not in itself an issue. However, my hands definitely tire if I try to do this for the entire passage here. Yet, by introducing some simple rotary motion, I'm able to keep my hands barely outstretched at all and let my wrists help to bring in each finger into play. I guess what I'm trying to say is that just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean that we should do it. We need to be looking for the best way of doing things for ourselves. Just because an amazing concert pianist does it in one way doesn't mean we'll ever get the same result in trying to copy the way she moves in this instance. And I'm sure there are plenty of passages where even she will absolutely use a much bigger range of motion where the gaps between the notes make this helpful for her. So whenever you're watching a YouTube video on how to do something, don't forget to think about, is this going to be a way that works well for you and your hand size? I hope these ideas will be helpful for you if, like me, you have smaller hands. Just remember that others have found ways of playing that mean they are not disadvantaged with smaller hands. If fine piano playing was simply a case of having pianist hands, then clearly there'd be far more amazing pianists than there are. If you have any tips for smaller-handed pianists, do let me know in the comments below too. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching and look forward to seeing you very soon.